been thinking a lot lately about the courage it takes to pursue truth, especially in conversations where there's a deep disagreement. And if it's a public conversation and people are representing different sides, it can be especially challenging. Well, I'm going to show you a clip of a part of a debate that displays a certain conflict, a tension that happens in a lot of debates. And so I'm going to show you this clip, and I want to invite you to consider this question. Who do you think has the upper hand in this particular exchange? This is taken from the Unbelievable radio show, and it's a debate between Hugh Ross and Peter Atkins. The clip starts with the moderator asking Peter Atkins a question. Listen.
At one level, some people might accuse you of being so committed to atheism that you'd never be willing to countenance any evidence that might lend support to a creator behind the universe. So I'm just interested, what sort of evidence could science or the physical universe present to you that would make you think, actually, that is evidence that there's a mind behind it?
Okay, how might you answer that question? If you're in Peter Atkins' shoes, what would you say? What do you think he should say? Here's what he says.
I find that a very difficult question. If I were looking in the Bible for evidence, heaven forbid, I would expect to see maybe increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. And that is
if there was literally an equation in the Bible,
equation
like
in
that.
the Bible, rather than all this wishy-washy, elastic writing that it pervades.
Right. So if there was something like that they discovered in the Bible,
then I'd think it was probably a forgery. Anyway.
Well, exactly. The problem is, would it actually make you?
No.
I mean, is there anything from, is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make, I mean, if the stars lined up to spell, Peter, please believe in me, it's about time.
I put it down to madness.
You put it down, to
personal madness.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like, Peter, that there's no evidence that will persuade you away from atheism.
Well, to be honest, I think that's probably the case.
I love what Peter is doing here, but it takes a lot of courage to do what he's doing, because what he's doing is he's seeing something, but what he is seeing is cutting against the dialectical layer of the debate. On the dialectical layer, there's a question about whether Peter's viewpoint is open to real testing. And behind this question is a question about whether Peter himself is willing to be wrong, whether he's a real truth seeker that wants to just revise his beliefs in accordance to whatever the evidence is. And if instead he suggests that his viewpoint is unfalsifiable, that there's no possible evidence that could move him, then this could call into question for the audience Peter's intellectual sincerity. I mean, is he really looking for the truth? But Peter knows this. I mean, this is obvious. This dialectical layer is obvious. But instead of allowing himself to be pushed along by the dialectical layer, or focusing on what might be dialectically most powerful, he focuses on something he genuinely thinks he sees to be true. And I actually think that he's seeing something right, and I'm going to point this out in a moment. Listen to what he says next.
Well, I'm predicting that there will be no such evidence. That's not quite the same thing as being committed to it a priori. I can't.
But you said there's no evidence that would persuade you otherwise.
I think it's much more likely that I would have gone mad than such evidence would have been provided.
So Peter continues for a bit along these lines, and then here's how the moderator interprets him.
So in principle, it's impossible to ever persuade you that God exists.
And then Hugh Ross puts it in terms of unfalsifiability.
I mean, a belief system isn't worth anything if it's not falsifiable.
That right there is the root of the worry. If your viewpoint is not even falsifiable, then it's like you're basically saying your viewpoint can't even be tested. In principle, if it can't be tested, how can you have a rational support for that belief? And so Ross is pressing on this point. Now, what's Peter going to say in response? I love what he says in response. It's the best thing. It's like this hidden gem in the conversation. It's hidden because I suspect that most people, whether you believe in God or not, will go along with this principle of falsifiability. But here's what Peter says.
I disagree, but go ahead.
That's it. I disagree, but go ahead. So he's standing firm to what he thinks is actually true, which is that falsifiability is not the criteria. It's not the mark of truth. In fact, you can have a belief, Your belief can be supported. He earlier talks about his viewpoint being progressively shown to be true. The evidence continues to show it to be true. He just can't conceive of what evidence could show it to be false. Like maybe it's possible in principle that he could be proved wrong, but he can't even think of what evidence would prove it wrong. He considers some candidate examples, and for every case, it's like, well, it's more probable that there's some other explanation. And I think that there's this intellectual honesty and courage that he's displaying. And I think he's right about the falsifiability principle. And I want to share that. This is kind of a side point, but I felt like the truth that he was seeing is one that was just missed. And as somebody who cares about truth, it's like my soul's crying out and saying, Peter's right. He's right. Even if he sort of looks weaker in the dialectic. So here's what I think he's right about. He's right that if you have a belief and you can't conceive of any way that that belief could be falsified, can't even think of possible evidence that would falsify it, that isn't thereby a mark against that belief. It's not a mark against the beliefs being true or even reasonable or even justified or even just supported by all the evidence that you have. I mean, when you think about it, any logically necessary principle, like the law of non-contradiction or the principle that A equals A for any A, cannot be falsified because it cannot be false. It's logically necessary. Or what about your own existence? Is there some evidence you could come across such that by seeing that evidence you could see, I don't exist? How could that be? I mean, in order for you to even see that evidence, you'd have to exist. Now, maybe there's a way of clarifying the principle of unfalsifiability, but I can tell you that I have not seen any clear definition of the principle that is general enough to apply to the big questions of worldview, but that isn't itself false. Now, there are limited applications of a principle of unfalsifiability. Maybe there are certain domains of truth that need to be falsifiable in principle. But it's strange to think that a proposition could not be true or known to be true unless it must be able to be shown to be false. Again, what if you had a proof from some axioms of mathematics or some basic principles of reason that something is true? If the proof is sound, it wouldn't be possible in principle to show that it's false. And that's not a mark against the proof, it's a mark against an unqualified principle of falsification. So in any case, whatever you think about the falsifiability principle, my main point is that when you find yourself in a conversation, you'll often find a tension between being intellectually honest, saying what you actually think is true. You could be wrong, but from your own perspective, being honest about how things seem to you, versus taking the road of intellectual or dialectical strength. Sometimes those things come apart, and it takes a certain kind of courage to pursue truth when there are crowds of people pressing in another direction. In a way, I think it takes more courage to pursue truth in a debate, especially when your reputation is on the line, than to pursue a dialectical victory. I want to close this video with a thought about how to have more courage in a debate. And this thought applies not just to debates, but applies to life in general. It's about how to have courage in any place in life where you're feeling pressures against you. And the key thought I have, the key idea, is that to have courage in the midst of a storm, you need to see something greater than the storm, something on the other side. In the case of a debate, what you can see is the value of truth and of your own internal integrity, which gives you greater power in the long term. You gain more power to influence, to see more things, and even more power to design your life in accordance with actual reality. You're going to see things that you might be missing because you were honest about how things seem to you. And so in that honesty, you've put yourself out there so that can be critiqued and corrected. The only way people can get your insights is if you're sharing them, and you're sharing them boldly and courageously. And in a way, you can't really make a mistake here, because even if what you think is true is not true, by standing firm on what you think is true and expressing that honestly, you've successfully opened yourself up to a productive conversation where you're learning and others are learning in the process. So I hope this video serves you as you courageously seek truth in every context. Thank you for watching.